Welcome back to the Pure Motivation Podcast. Today we are diving deep into a topic that I think is relevant to pretty much everyone. Toxic relationships. And it's so interesting because I think so often we talk about the big dramatic blowouts. But what's interesting in these sources you sent me is they paint this picture of toxicity being so much more subtle.
Yeah.
It's like the slow drip of poison, rather than just this sudden explosion.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it. It is, that slow drip. It can really be insidious. And one of the sources talks about it almost like you're constantly walking on eggshells. You're never really quite knowing what might set the other person off. And it's that tension, that constant unease that's just so draining over time.
Yeah, it's almost like this constant pressure cooker situation.
Exactly.
And the sources actually go even deeper into this idea of toxic relationships involving a power imbalance.
Yeah.
And it's not always, as obvious as yelling or even physical abuse. It's about control.
Right.
And manipulation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's fascinating how these sources use this analogy of the Michelangelo phenomenon. Have you ever heard of that?
I have not.
So in a healthy relationship, partners act like these skilled sculptors. They kind of chip away at each other's rough edges, and they're helping each other become their best selves. But in a toxic relationship, it's almost like one partner is trying to mold the other into something that they're not. They're chipping away at their self-esteem, their individuality in the process.
Wow. That's such a powerful image.
Yeah.
Instead of supporting each other's growth, one person's trying to control and confine the other. And speaking of control, one of the things these sources go into is some specific behaviors that can be real red flags. And one that really stood out to me was isolation. It's almost like the toxic partner is trying to cut you off from all your friends, your family, making you more dependent on them.
Yeah. It's a classic manipulation tactic. And it's not always as blatant as forbidding you to see certain people. It can be more subtle, like constantly criticizing your loved ones or making you feel guilty for spending time with them.
Right. It's all about kind of undermining your support system and making you question your own judgment.
Exactly.
And these sources also talk about gaslighting, which is such a crazy form of manipulation. Can you maybe elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. Gaslighting is a form of emotional abuse, where the manipulator is basically twisting reality, trying to make the victim doubt their own sanity. So they plant these seeds of doubt that make you question your memories, your perceptions, and even your feelings.
It's so insidious because the examples these sources give are things like denying things that clearly happened or insisting that you're overreacting or you're imagining things.
Right. And over time, this constant manipulation can really erode your self-confidence and make you feel like you just can't even trust your own instincts.
Yeah, it's like slowly chipping away at your sense of self, which actually goes back to that whole Michelangelo analogy. And it's really important to remember that, these toxic behaviors can manifest in different ways. The sources emphasize that toxicity isn't always about, dramatic outbursts. It can actually be disguised as caring or protectiveness.
Yeah, and that can make it really hard to recognize. Toxic partners can be incredibly charming and manipulative. They might shower you with attention one minute and then criticize you the next, keeping you constantly off balance.
And I think that kind of push and pull just creates a cycle of anxiety and dependence. For anyone listening who's starting to see some of these red flags in their own relationship, I just want to remind you that you are not alone. There are so many resources available to help you, and one great place to start is puremotivationpodcast.com. We have a whole section dedicated to healthy relationships, with articles, tips, and even links to support organizations.
Yeah, it's a fantastic resource. And seeking help is not a sign of weakness. It's actually a sign of strength. Now, while recognizing the signs is crucial, understanding why it's so hard to leave a toxic relationship is equally important. And these sources delve into some really complex psychological factors, and we're going to explore those in more detail after the break. Leaving a toxic relationship, it's not as simple as just walking away. It's a process, often a really messy and painful one. And these sources do such a good job of explaining why it can feel so impossible.
Yeah, reading through these, it really struck me just how many different factors are at play. It's everything from fear and self-doubt to these really practical concerns, even deep-seated psychological patterns.
Right.
It's like you're trying to escape a maze, but the walls are invisible.
It really is like that. And one of those invisible walls is often just fear. The sources point out that people in these relationships, they feel the unknown. What if life without this partner, even if it's a bad relationship, is somehow worse?
Yeah, it's like better the devil you know kind of thing.
Exactly.
And of course, there's that fear of being alone, starting over, especially if you've invested so much time and energy into the relationship already.
And then you add on top of that, the sources talk about how some people have this really strong sense of hope, almost this belief that things will magically change if they just try hard enough.
Oh, yeah, that's so relatable. It's natural to want to believe that the person you love can change,
Of course.
but the sources, they caution against clinging to that hope,
Yeah.
especially when there's this clear pattern of toxic behavior.
And you know, what I found really insightful was how the sources connect this idea of past trauma to the difficulty of leaving these relationships. Someone who's experienced abuse or neglect in the past, they might be more likely to put up with unhealthy behavior in the present. It's like their internal alarm system isn't working properly.
That's huge. It really underscores how important it is to address any past wounds and develop that strong sense of self-worth. Because without that foundation, it's so easy to fall back into those familiar patterns, even when they're harmful.
Exactly. And, speaking of self-worth, the sources emphasize how much toxic relationships can damage your confidence,
Oh, absolutely.
making it that much harder to believe you deserve better. It's like that constant criticism and negativity gets internalized, and suddenly you're questioning your own value.
And then, of course, you have the very practical challenges. The sources go into this too, right?
Yeah.
It can seem impossible to leave. Things like, what if you're financially dependent on your partner? Or maybe you're afraid of what other people will think.
Oh, yeah. Those practical barriers, they're real, and they can feel incredibly daunting when you combine them with all that emotional and psychological turmoil. It's like staring at a mountain of obstacles.
And the sources talk about shame as a huge factor as well. It's so easy to feel embarrassed or ashamed for being in this situation.
Yeah.
And that can stop people from reaching out for help or even confiding in their loved ones.
It's almost like this double bind, right? The toxic relationship is isolating you, and then the shame of being in that relationship makes it even harder to connect with other people. But it's so, so important to remember that asking for help is not weak. It's actually incredibly strong. And if you're looking for resources, a great place to start is puremotivationpodcast.com. We have a whole section on navigating these kinds of situations and building healthy relationships.
And going beyond even those practical and emotional barriers, these sources go deep into the psychology of it all. They talk about codependency and unhealthy attachment styles. These can really create this incredibly powerful pull to stay in a relationship, even when you know it's bad for you.
Yeah, codependency is so complex. It's often this excessive reliance on the other person for validation. It's like your whole sense of self-worth is tied up in them. And then you have these unhealthy attachment styles, often stemming from your childhood experiences. And it can lead to these patterns where you're seeking out relationships that mirror those early wounds, like you're unconsciously drawn to what's familiar, even if it's not healthy for you.
It's so interesting how the sources connect these early experiences to our relationships as adults.
Yeah.
And of course, we can't forget about manipulation. They go back to that, especially gaslighting, something we talked about earlier.
Right. And the sources, they give some really powerful examples of how gaslighting can literally make you doubt your own reality. They're subtly distorting your perceptions, making you question memories, your sanity even. It's incredibly disorienting. You lose trust in yourself.
And it's not just about what they're saying. It's like they're constantly shifting the goalposts so you can never feel secure in your judgment. And, one of the sources points out that when you're dealing with a narcissist, leaving can be even more challenging because they will often react with anger
Yeah.
and really try to regain control when you try to break free.
That's true. Narcissism adds a whole other layer of complexity because there's often this lack of empathy, this inflated sense of self-importance. So the sources suggest setting really firm boundaries, having a strong support system. And in some cases, you might even need to seek legal advice.
So we've talked about why it can feel like this impossible uphill battle to leave a toxic relationship. But the good news is these sources do offer hope. They emphasize that it is possible to break free, and they outline some steps you can take to reclaim your life, your happiness. So let's get into those. So we've talked about recognizing a toxic relationship and all the reasons why it can be so hard to actually leave. But let's focus now on what these sources say about breaking free, because the good news is it is possible.
It is. It really is. It's a journey, and it might not be easy, but these sources give some great advice for how to navigate the process. And one of the most important things they emphasize over and over again is prioritizing safety.
Especially if there's any kind of abuse going on. These sources really stress having a safety plan. That might mean reaching out to friends or family you trust, getting your finances in order, documenting any abuse that's happening, and if you need to, even getting a restraining order.
Exactly. It's about taking those concrete steps to protect yourself, both physically and emotionally. And speaking of support, the sources also talk a lot about seeking professional guidance.
Yeah, therapy can be huge. A therapist can help you process all these emotions, rebuild your self-esteem, and come up with strategies for leaving and healing. And they can also help you with any underlying issues that might be contributing to why you're putting up with this unhealthy behavior. Things like past trauma or maybe an insecure attachment style.
It's like having a guide to help you through this really complicated and difficult terrain. And beyond individual therapy, the sources also mention the value of support groups.
Oh yeah, support groups are great because they can provide that sense of community and shared understanding. No, you're not alone in this. And beyond professional help, the sources also emphasize the importance of leaning on your friends and family. Build a strong support network.
Yeah, surround yourself with people who believe in you, who uplift you, people who can provide that practical and emotional support when you need it most.
And one of the sources had this really interesting point about setting clear boundaries with the toxic partner.
Boundaries are so important. They're like these invisible fences that protect your mental and emotional well-being. And the sources give some really good examples, like learning to say no more often, maybe limiting contact, or refusing to have conversations that are just going to be hurtful or unproductive. It's
Yeah.
about taking back your power and letting the other person know what you will and will not tolerate.
It's about shifting the dynamic, right? And, reading through these sources, I was really struck by how much they emphasize clear communication. It's not always easy, especially with a manipulative partner, but the sources suggest being direct, firm, and assertive when you're communicating your decision to leave.
Yeah, you've got to be clear. And they also warn about getting pulled into arguments or trying to justify your decision. You don't have to do that. It's about stating your truth, sticking to those boundaries you set, and not getting sucked back in.
And once you've made that decision to leave, the sources are pretty clear. Cut off contact, or at least minimize it as much as you can.
You need to create space for yourself to heal and move on. It might seem harsh, but it's often necessary to protect yourself from more manipulation and hurt.
It's like when you have a thorn in your hand, you have to get it out so the wound can heal. And speaking of healing, the sources spend a good amount of time talking about that phase, emphasizing that it's a process, not just this one-time event.
Exactly. Healing takes time. It takes patience with yourself and a lot of self-compassion. The sources say it's important to allow yourself to grieve the relationship, even if it wasn't a good one. It's okay to feel sad, angry, confused, hurt. All of those feelings are valid.
It's about letting yourself feel those emotions, not trying to bury them or rush through it. And, one of the things that really resonated with me was how much the sources emphasize self-care.
Self-care is so important. It's about replenishing your energy and finding those things that bring you joy. Get enough sleep, eat nourishing foods, move your body in ways that feel good, do things that light you up.
Treat yourself with the kindness and compassion you would offer a friend going through a hard time. And the sources also talk about the importance of forgiveness, forgiving yourself.
That's so important. Let go of any shame or guilt you might be carrying for staying in that relationship. You did the best you could with what you knew at the time. Now it's about moving forward with compassion for yourself.
And as you're healing, the sources say focus on rebuilding your self-esteem, which probably took a hit during that toxic relationship.
It really does. It's about recognizing your worth, reclaiming it, and remembering your value as a person. Do things that make you feel good about yourself. Maybe it's pursuing a passion, learning something new, setting goals, or just being around people who truly appreciate you.
It's about finding your shine again. And the sources also talk about how important it is to learn from this experience. Take some time to reflect on the relationship and think about the red flags you might have missed.
It's about understanding the patterns, what needs weren't being met, the things that led you to that unhealthy situation. Because that knowledge is so powerful. It can help you make better choices in the future.
It's like turning this whole experience into a lesson, a stepping stone on the path to creating healthier, more fulfilling relationships. And for anyone out there feeling overwhelmed, not sure where to even begin, there's help out there. And a great place to start is puremotivationpodcast.com. We have a whole section on healthy relationships, overcoming challenges, and rebuilding your life after a difficult experience.
It's a fantastic resource with articles, tips, and links to organizations that can provide support and guidance. And while this might feel like a really daunting journey, these sources offer a message of hope. They emphasize over and over again that healing is possible. You can break free from the patterns of the past and create a future full of love, joy, and healthy connections.
You can. And it's about remembering that you deserve to be in relationships that bring you joy, peace, and a real sense of belonging.
Mm.
Toxic relationships, they're like thorns that can really hurt.
Mm.
But you have the power to remove those thorns and allow yourself to blossom.
That's such a great way to put it. And while it might feel scary to even imagine life after this relationship, the sources remind us that there's a lot of freedom waiting for you on the other side.
So much freedom and opportunity. It's a chance to rediscover who you are, what you really want in life, what makes you truly happy. It's time to explore, reconnect with yourself, and create a life that's in line with your values and dreams.
It's about embracing the journey.
The ups, the downs, the lessons, all of the growth that comes with stepping out of that darkness and into the light. To anyone out there struggling with a toxic relationship, you are not alone. You are so much stronger than you think, and you deserve to be happy.
Healing is possible. It might not be easy, but it is so worth it. And if you need help, please reach out. There are people who care and resources that can support you. A brighter future is waiting for you.
Thank you for listening to the Pure Motivation Podcast, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.